Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is our first lecture panel discussion as part of the University Hall Gallery here at UMass Boston. So thank you all for attending. I would like to ask if anybody has their cell phones on them, if you can please turn off the ringer, just so we're uninterrupted. We're also recording this and streaming it on Facebook. So if you like to get included in any of our social media, you can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook at UH Gallery. So at the letter U, the letter H, and the word gallery. So I'm Sam Toabe. I'm the University Hall Gallery Curator. I've been here since January, and this is the first exhibition that I've curated here. And I would like to thank all the panelists for coming, and for Steve Locke, Joiri Minaya, and Dred Scott for including their artwork in the show, as well as Barbara Lewis, the director of the Trotter Center here at UMass Boston, for coming and being part of the conversation tonight. So I'll just do introductions just to start. Barbara Lewis is the director. She's on the far end of the table. She's the director of the William Monroe Trotter Institute for the Study of Black History and Culture, as well as an associate professor of English in the College of Liberal Arts here at University of Massachusetts, Boston. She received her PhD in theater from the City University of New York. She is an author of essays concerning the intersection between art, racial politics, and identity, such as a piece entitled An American Circus, The Lynch Victim as a Clown, which has been published by the likes of University of Iowa Press, Macmillan Palgrave, and Routledge, amongst others. Dred Scott, which is to her right, he is an interdisciplinary artist who makes revolutionary art to propel history forward. His practice has first received national attention in 1989 while a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for an artwork entitled What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag, which can be seen here. The piece first became the center of controversy when the sitting president, George Herbert Walker Bush, denounced it, and the U.S. Senate passed legislation banning it, leading to a landmark court decision that made it illegal to lay an American flag on the ground as a form of desecration. His work has been included in recent exhibitions at MoMA PS1, the Walker Art Center, the Brooklyn Museum, and was included in America's Hard to See, the inaugural exhibition held at the reopening of the Whitney Museum of American Art. To his right, we have Joiri Minaya, who was born in the Dominican Republic and lives between the United States and her birth country. She graduated from the ENAV in Santo Domingo, DR, in 2009, as well as the Altos de Chavon School of Design in La Roma, DR, in 2011, and the New School for Design at Parsons in 2013. She attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2013 as well. She's a recipient of an Emerging Arts Award from the Rema Hort Mann Foundation and the Joan Mitchell Foundation in 2015, among others. Her work deals with representation, identity constructions, gender roles, migration, and nature from both personal and larger transcultural and historical frames. And to my left, we have Steve Locke, who is a Boston-based artist raised in Detroit, Michigan. He received a Bachelor's of Science in 1984 from Boston University, as well as a Bachelor's of Fine Art in 1997 and a Master's in Fine Art in 2001 from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. He attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2002. He has received grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, the Arts Matter Foundation, and the LEF Foundation Contemporary Work Fund grant. His solo exhibition, curated by Helen Molesworth, entitled There's No One Left to Blame, traveled from the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston to the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit. His work has been reviewed in Art Forum, in Art in America, Art New England, Juxtapose, the Boston Globe, and the New Yorker. So thank you all for coming and participating.
Thanks, Sam.
In the talk.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so just to give a little bit of an overview of the exhibition, which we can all see at the reception afterwards. It's entitled Political Discourse. It includes a variety of work from artists that belong to communities that I'm concerned about receiving censorship or oppression from the current presidential administration, that including artists of color, artists from the LGBTQ community, female artists, and immigrant artists working in the States. So I brought together work that kind of toes the line between being either overtly political or that can be seen within a political framework now that there's been this change in administration in our country after the election. So to get started, this conversation's going to be kind of free form. I'm going to ask a few questions, and I hope that the panelists can answer. We're going to start very broadly and then work to more narrow subjects, and I'll even ask each panelist some pointed questions. And if any of the panelists would like to intervene at any time and ask their own questions of either the other panelists or myself, feel free to do so. And there will also be time at the end of the conversation for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to chime in at the end. So yeah, to start off, panelists, I just wanted to see if you could give us some thoughts on what you think about when you hear the term political art.
We're all pretending we didn't get this question in advance.
I mean, we did get the questions in advance, and so you should have all written essays on this. No, I mean, I think two things. I think that basically all art is political, some more overtly so and some less so. But in a world where the majority of people work with their hands and don't have the luxury to work with ideas, to have the freedom and you know, to spend most of our time either in our studios or applying to grants or talking with each other at panels like this, we, I think, have a responsibility to look at the world, and whatever, regardless of that responsibility or not, one feels, what you're saying does reflect on the world that we live in, and I think, you know, it should. The question is, what are the politics? I don't think that sort of just the act of making art means that it reflects, you know, say my particular political views if another artist makes it, or that even, you know, now, well, you know, a lot of people have said, well, in this era where there is such repression against the arts and where the president is trying to clamp down on all sorts of free expression from the press to the arts, that just the act of making it is defiant. And I think, well, I think that's important, but frankly, there could be, you know, a lot of art that actually upholds the status quo. I mean, you know, you look at, you know, fascist Germany and the images that came out with Leni Riefenstahl and stuff. Well, if there were a lot more filmmakers doing that kind of work, that'd be a real problem, in my opinion. And so, you know, I think that the question is, what are the artists' politics, and how do they intentionally try and bring that in some ways into their art? And which is not to say that all art should be expressly taking a particular view on something, but I do think that you know, in a world where, you know, a tiny handful of people controls the great wealth and the knowledge that humanity as a whole has created, you know, either you're going to uphold that in ways large or small, or you're going to fight to change that status quo. And I choose the latter.
I come at the idea of politics and art very much from the perspective of Greek theater, because that is what has often drawn me, not so much the Greek theater, but the idea of art as an assembler, as energy and emotion that brings people together. And at the time of the Greeks and those very large outdoor theaters, the idea was that the polis, or the people, were represented by everyone who was looking at that theater, understanding those stories, resonating with those emotions, and unified into wholeness, unified into strength. And for me, this idea of politics and art, I see art as very much an element of connection, Yes, there's the individual voice, the individual understanding, but often that, not always, but often that individual voice and emotion reaches out into the community and draws the community together. There are times, though, and we might be in one of those times. This, for me, will be a fascinating part of our discussion tonight. There are times when art steps away from pulls away from what might be the thrust of the community. For me, art is very much about community, about pulling people together, about strengthening people, about expression, about voice, about humanity and emotion.
Yeah, I think that from the moment that you decide to show your art, if you're not an artist that, doesn't show their art, you're making it political, because politics is about more than one individual, basically, and what happens there. So I think all art is political to a degree, some of it more overt than other. And then I think there's an imbalance in how we read politics into art historically, and there's art that has, kind of has been defined as standard and neutral, and then that's something that needs to be revised and questioned often. But it's not devoid of politics because we were brought up thinking maybe that it is. So that's a thought about.
Yeah. Do you have something to add, Steve? I was just going to say that was my next question is, is all art political? And if so, why? I don't think that necessarily all art is intended to be political from the maker, but there are certainly ways in which it can be contextualized as political.
Well, I think in law they say that intent follows the bullet. So it's not really like the intention, I'm going to die one day, so these things that I make have to have a life of their own. And they're going to function the way that they function without me. If they're any good, they're going to be interesting whether I'm here or not. If they're not interesting, you think about all the sort of exhibitions that have happened, the sort of like, those exhibitions that used to happen before all of you were born, like in the 70s, like 10 Americans or like New Art Now. Like, where are all those people? Like, not all those people have remained a part of the discourse, and some of that is fashion, and some of that is economics, and some of that is just the quality of the work. So I think that it's the use of art that becomes political. It's not so much the intention of the artist, because the intention of the artist is going to die with the artist. How we use these objects, how we use these one-of-a-kind images that are wrought by humans, that is what becomes political over time. Now, I have my own reasons for making what I make, and some of them are completely crazy. Like, they don't make any sense to anyone but me, And some of them I think, oh, I'm gonna show David Hockney. Like, I'm just gonna straighten him out with my work. Like, he doesn't care about what I'm doing, right? But that engine to make the work is unique to every artist. I think that sort of to piggyback on what Dred was saying, that I don't have the luxury of not being able to live in the world. Like, I live in the world. So I don't live in my head. I live in the world among communities. And the things that affect communities affect me, and that affects the work that I make. I do think that certain people are forced to make political art because they're sort of, they're marginalized. So like black people make black art, and then women make women's art, and then queer people make queer art. And some group of people gets to make art, and that is supposed to be like neutral, like Jody was saying, it's supposed to be neutral and not about anything but the pure contemplation of form. But all that stuff is, like, who has the luxury to make that? Who has the mental space to make that? That is part of the political charge that's baked into the circumstance of art. But objects in and of themselves, they get used differently.
To piggyback on that, also, even when you have black and queer and women artists making work devoid of politics or abstract art or whatever it is, they become then representational and they become politicized, even in their desire to be apolitical. So, yeah.
It's like that room is closed off to them. Like, you know, that sort of neutral, because of their subjectivity, that the idea of neutrality is closed off.
But I also think that the notion that sort of, you know, women make women art, queer people make queer art, black people, I mean, it's like, you know, if Ben Carson made art, that wouldn't be the kind of art that I make. And I know you don't mean it, but I just, you know, it's like, good. No, I mean, I just think this thing of where I mean, a lot of times people, I mean, the assumption that, say, black people have a monolithic view is, obviously we all know that that's not true. But, and yes, I do think more artists of color or more black artists actually make art that is explicitly talking about race and racism and what it means to be black in America. But not everybody does, and I think that and frankly, I don't think everybody should. I mean, I just think, you know, there is a freedom to make whatever art you want, but that's, you know, for a, say, Puerto Rican artist or for a European American artist to make either work about sort of black identity or to make work about, you know, color field painting, they're each making choices, and, you know, one could be, you could sort of say, oh, well, that's more understandable. The white person views themselves as neutral, therefore they're just talking about pure form. But each of them are making choices, and it's just that one gets pigeonholed one way and another gets pigeonholed another way.
I totally agree. I think that the classic example is someone like Robert Ryman, right? We don't talk about that work in terms of whiteness.
Yeah.
We talk about it in terms of form and purity and experimentation and all this stuff. Let's just have a conversation about whiteness and talk about that work, right? And like no one wants to take that on because his work isn't about race.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I kind of think it is.
Yeah.
I kind of think that the Mary Cassatt paintings are about race.
Yeah.
Like, can we just have that conversation?
Or let's talk about any of this work and just talk about form, because you could do that. I mean, I play by the same rules. It's just that I'm bringing different politics into.
I like form.
I do too.
I also love form.
I think it's dangerous to think of black art or black people making only black art and women making only woman art and queer people only making queer art. There's a range, and as has already been said, yes, that does sometimes happen. Sometimes when you belong to a particular group, you express not only your personal view, but you pull together with others who might share your views. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you can be black and individual too. Sometimes you can be queer and totally into who you are and what you are at that particular moment in that particular time, and you transcend categories. I'm hoping that at this point in the 21st century, we not only have dual possibilities, but we have triple and quadruple and quintuple. I mean, that we speak more than one language. We can fit into more than one register. That, you know, we have malleability, we have mobility, and we can speak within limited spaces or smaller spaces. We can speak within larger spaces too. For me, that's one of the challenges of now. One of the challenges of now in a world that's highly, highly mobile is that we have lots of places to go and lots of things to say and lots of ways in which we can say them and lots of people who can hear us, and that the people who can hear us are not only existing within the particular background that we happen to have been brought up in.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I just wanted to mention two ideas that I thought of when you were speaking, and it's not, I think we all agree with all of that. But there's definitely a matter of the system and how, or not, I don't know if the system, about, you know, expectations, academia, society, all of these like larger systems and how they read the work and the literacy to have, you know, different entry points to the work. They see a label and that's their entry point, and then they don't see the expansiveness or the universality of what is being expressed. So that is already pigeonhole thing, the dialogue. And then there's this other matter of the urgency with which these communities need to talk about their particular experience because they don't see themselves represented out there. So, which is why, you know, stereotypically you might have the vision or the, you know, the impression that these particular communities only make art about their communities. Yeah.
But I think part of that, I mean, you know, in the show that Sam's curated, I mean, some of the work that I have is photographs from the early 80s that are of punk clubs in Chicago. And, you know, I mean, admittedly, there are some black people in the photographs, but the bigger thing is, like, so there's photographs of my friends during a time well, friends and colleagues during a time that there was tremendous upheaval in society, and a small subgroup of that society was listening to particular music and went to clubs, and I photographed it. But the thing is, it's like, regardless of whether that's what people would think of as black art, I can't not make black art. I mean, you know, it's like that work wouldn't look like what you would say, oh yeah, that's, you know, it looks like LaToya Ruby Frazier or Hank Willis Thomas or whoever, but, you know, it's like, well, I'm a black person, therefore I make black art. Whatever I make is black art. It doesn't mean it's all good. And I mean, I think the expansion is that recognizing that there are people that have particular social and as well as individualized experience, but that if what you're defining as, say, black art or women's art is art that specifically talks about blackness or talks about women's issues, that's actually limiting.
I think that there's a way in which, you know, what Whitney Chadwick says, like, instead of modernism, we propose feminism, right? So, like, let's change the lens. Instead of looking at everything through a modernist lens, let's look at Pollock as if he's a feminist. Let's just look at it and use that lens to talk about the work. And I think that there's a way in which the lenses don't get changed. Like, so when I think about this idea of racializing objects or racializing experience, I have that experience every day in my lived life. In my studio life, like, I'm having a conversation with Matisse. Like, I'm having a conversation with someone else. And, like, I have, because I'm an artist, I get to have access to all of visual culture. It all belongs to me. And so, like, you're constantly told institutionally and sometimes in educational environments that this is yours. Like, this part is yours and that part doesn't belong to you. But I just ignored that. Like, I thought that was, I thought it was silly. I thought everything belonged to me, from, like, the caves of Lascaux to, like, you know, artists I don't like Dash Snow or something like that. Like, all that stuff belonged to me, right? I'm sure he's God rest his soul, you know what I mean? I'm sure he's a very nice person. I just never cared for that work. But it was part of, like, what I was interested in, being in a larger dialogue. And I think the hard thing is allowing people to frame you that's pernicious, and it's constant in the contemporary moment. Like, people want to tell you who you are and what your work is about, and that, like, that's about them. Like, that was the thing that I learned early on, that when people were talking about my work as meaning this, whatever meaning they got from it, like, the work was just doing what it was supposed to do. I didn't have any connection to that. Like, for me, I look at my work and I think, oh, that's interesting. Like, you know what I mean? Sometimes you finish a piece and it's just doing, you just turn it to the viewer. And it's just doing whatever it does in the world. And when people would bring stuff to my work, they had the freedom to bring it. I didn't have to embrace it. That was just the stuff that they were bringing. And I think that that's what's hard now, is that people are bringing stuff to the work as if the artist is responsible for their stuff. It's like, no, that's about you, baby. That's not about me. Like, I just made an object that allowed you to dream, but I'm not responsible for your dreams, you know?
When you say this thing about the entire art history belonging to you, what do you think about appropriation then when it comes from, you know, let's say in this hierarchical way when you have, like, you know, groups of people who have been oppressed, you know, being appropriated their cultural stuff?
I think there's a difference between, well, let me just say that power and privilege are discursive, right? So people, I'm not like this, I never thought I was powerless. I knew I didn't have the same privilege or the same access as other people, but I certainly never felt like I had no power. I had a different kind of power, and I had to realize it differently. Now, I've appropriated every Western artist because that's part of my culture. Like, that's my culture. That's not white people's culture. That's my culture. And when people are saying, like, you're appropriating something from someone else, it's like, no, it's all mine. No, I'm saying in general. So, like, but see, I think that, like, when I look at, like, the ways that there's this notion that things affect black people and they don't affect white people. Like, somehow that, like, there's black culture and there's white culture, or there's this culture and that culture. No, it's just culture. And I think that there's a way in which when we start to talk about ownership of culture, that's different than ownership of people or ownership of resources. So, like, appropriating an image, like, that's the story of human experience, is that things are appropriated from other people. I know that people get upset, like, oh, that like Urban Outfitters use, like, a tribal pattern on, like, a shirt. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. That's, like, I think that that's kind of weird, and I don't, or when people get, like, tribal tattoos, I'm like, what tribe is that? Like, I don't even know what that is. Like, it's just some sort of weird, uninterrogated way of self-expression, right? So those things give me pause. But as an artist, I think that artists do whatever they do. They look at things, they get informed by other things. But the notion that one side is weak and plundered and the other side is strong and rapacious, I've never felt that way.
And
There's a really interesting piece by the Kenyan artist Wangechi Mutu in her recent show where she sort of reinterpreted or flipped the script on a famous Brancusi, which is just this beautiful polished gold face that's become iconic in every art history student that studies in the Western canon. You know the work, but she sort of brought sort of sensibilities of what if the woman that Brancusi was studying basically had locks and stuff, and so it like completely changed, but it's with the same formal strategy and technique, and it's like, well, which one is appropriation? It's just like, well, I'm picturing a human being with particular styles and referencing culture, which I'm part of lots of different cultures and have access to, and so I'm just using it. Yet it is sort of transgressive and an intervention within what it destabilizes what is thought of as traditional Western art history and the ideas about art and who has the right to do what with images, which I think is great.
Mm-hmm. And
for me, there's a very important line between access and appropriation. For me, appropriation is taking without acknowledgement, assuming that you originated it, whereas access is using what's there, what's available to be used, not claiming that it's yours, except what you have done with it, how you have improved it, how you have changed it. So for me, there's this very important distinction between credit and improvement. If you improve something and you acknowledge the source from which it comes, as I feel you're talking about in terms of Brancusi, that's one thing. That's adding to what already exists. But for me, appropriation is taking from what exists and not giving full credit to what has been taken.
Thank you all. That's great. So just to keep moving forward with questions, Sarah Lewis wrote in Aperture last summer that American citizenship has long been a project of vision and justice. Can each of you talk a little bit about how important visual literacy is to being a critically informed citizen?
Hell no. I mean, no, I mean, yeah. No, I mean, it's like, look, you know, Sarah Lewis is big-brained. I like Sarah Lewis, but I think that statement of America has been a project of, you know, vision and no, it hasn't. It's been a project of plundering, and it's. I mean, America was founded on slavery and genocide. It's not about freedom. It's not about largesse of vision, except the vision to conquer land, displace people, and make profit. That's, I mean, you know, and so the whole premise of the conversation is flawed. But in terms of the importance of visual literacy, that's a whole different question. I do think that actually literacy in all forms and critical inquiry is extremely important right now. You know, even the question of truth is being contested. And at that moment, it's like, it's really important that y'all like actually be critical thinkers where, you know, it's like where the question, I mean, the question put, you know, there's this thing of like fake news and alternative facts. It's like, well, no such thing as alternative facts. Alternative facts are lies. Facts are facts. There is no alternative truth, you know, and fake news is like, well, it's not just news that suits or does not suit your particular political persuasion. And so, you know, I think that I mean, there was an article I was just reading talking about why satirists are actually so good at reporting the news right now, and talking about people like Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah and Samantha Bee, and they're actually saying, look, these people are actually good at reporting the news of what's actually going on because they have a low tolerance for bullshit. And I think that visual literacy has to be sort of the same way. And it really, it's taught, there's a section of society that's being systematically misinformed and trained not to think critically and to accept whatever powerful forces tell them, as opposed to looking and actually evaluating for themselves and having an understanding of sort of what is the basis of evaluating fact, and what is the basis of evaluating, you know, even your interest, which is, that talks about bias, is not fact, but having visual literacy, being able to look at, you know, images and know the history that they reside in. If you, you know, are robbed of that, don't have that as an sort of a background, and by, I mean, and I say educational background, but not that people get educated necessarily, you know, in schools, but if you, you know, it's like, if, you know, if you don't, I mean, somebody mentioned Jackson Pollock earlier, I think. And, you know, it's like, if you don't know what was interesting about why Pollock was doing what he's doing, and it gets reduced down to, oh, he's just genius because he got, you know, his paint drips were better than anybody else's paint drips, that actually completely misses why the work was interesting and kind of path-breaking for its time. And you'll just say, oh, any crap in a hotel is genius because that person dripped paint. And it's like, no, it's not. It's a bad copy of something that was actually path-breaking. It's like if I formed a band and played all songs just like the Beatles now, nobody would care. But when they did it back then, or if I even did James Brown, who I actually like more than the Beatles, or Public Enemy, or Kendrick Lamar, well, you know, if you copy what's already been done exactly like they've done it, but nobody else knows that it's a copy, it's one thing. But if everybody else knows it's a copy, then it's like, no, bring something new. And so visual literacy is, I think, really important, both to understanding the history, but able to read what people are actually saying, including in art. So,
I think it's important to remember that, like, truth and lies are constantly manipulated to serve structures of power, and that concept, that binary, is easily, you know, misguiding sometimes. And just to add to what you were saying about visual literacy, I do think, I mean, all forms of literacy, of course, contribute to being informed, but the ability of being informed. But I was thinking about this idea of being able to read an image and put it in relation to certain history, what history and who determined that history. And I think we also need to question those power structures of who gets to determine histories depending on like what point of view. Again, thinking that truth and lie, thinking about how truth and lie are easily manipulated into, you know, shaping power and all that. Yeah.
I get really interested in objective truth, like that sort of idea, because I believe in facts, but I'm not so, like Jody, I'm not so sure about the truth. Like, I think the truth is fugitive, right? Depending on, because I think that a lot of the people who sort of settled the West were acting out of truth. They really believed what they were doing was the right thing to do. It wasn't, but that's really what they believed. So, like, if we go by, it's like I have a student who I love, and they're just wonderful. But we were having this conversation about the Second Amendment, and I was saying how I was getting trained to use a firearm because I wanted to learn, to have that embodied experience. And the student said to me, "Oh, I don't believe in guns." And I said, guns are very real. They're real. It's not a matter of belief. So that whole thing about like the structure of belief and truth being the anchor, that's problematic. Like, if we can get down to some bedrock, that is what works a little bit better. But when we start to talk about truth, we get to have this really great conversation about bias and position and all that sort of stuff. That's the part that's great about arguing about truth. That's what was fun about listening to Torah chat on New York radio, when you would have the rabbis debating. Like, this is before you were born. It was so much fun. I'm not Jewish, and I don't know anything about it, but I loved hearing them debate. It was so great because they were so passionate about it, because they both thought that they had a corner on the truth. And that, to me, is really, that's where we tease it out when we're talking about truth. But I think the visual literacy question, too many people are going on their own beliefs. And beliefs, like I said, are fugitive. And it can become, if you're structuring the world based on your beliefs, we get into trouble. Because I think that beliefs shift. And when you start to build a structure on a basis of something that's shifting, you're asking for trouble. You're just asking for it.
So when I was preparing for the conversation tonight, I asked the panelists to submit a few questions. And Barbara, you submitted one that I think goes well in line with where the conversation's at. Would you rather I read it, or? Yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, sure.
Barbara disagrees with what she asked.
So Barbara wrote, "It could be argued that the current occupant of the Oval Office," and she put in parentheses OOO, has a tendency to uncouple truth from the actual. Might such capital city preference for the imagined encourage greater artistic exploration of the relationship between the artist and the political? And I kind of interpreted that as asking how are artists dealing with this idea of truth. It's often said too that artists, we're like talking about satirists, speak more truth by telling lies. So I don't know if you can expand upon that, maybe in talking about your own work or work that comes to mind.
I can tell you a little bit of a roundabout story about my practice, right?
Yeah.
I started out as a portrait painter. Like, I wanted sergeant's job, like go like meet some rich person and like go to their house and paint their portrait, and like eventually like it would get handed down through the generations and end up in a museum. Like, that's the job that I thought I wanted. Over time, I realized that first of all, there's this thing called photography, which is really, and you should check it out. It's really amazing. It's just amazing. It's so much faster than making a painting. But then, in addition, I started to wonder if I was being honest in my practice. personally. Like, what is at stake in going to someone's house and making a painting of them? And that became the big question for me in graduate school and in my life as an artist now. So it's not so much I'm asking myself about truth, right? Although that is part of it. I'm really asking myself, what is at stake? Like, if I'm going to do this, what's at stake for me as the artist, for the viewer, for the discourse of art? Like, what's at stake? And it's not just, like, when I made the piece for the show, I am no longer interested in making a bunch of paintings and hanging them 50 inches on center. Like, I'm no longer interested in that, because I think that there's more at stake in the way that we imagine and image the body and talk about the way portraits of men are indicators of power. I think that there's more at stake in shifting the way that we approach that. So I think that if the election of 45 has done anything, it's made me personally think about what's at stake in making an image now. Like, what kind of image am I going to make when, in my opinion, the country is sort of teetered over the brink into fascism? Like, what's at stake for me as an artist, for me as an educator, for me as a citizen in this current moment?
I just want to pull up Steve's installation piece, just a reference. Sorry, it's a little bit. Oh, you know what? Excuse me. Sorry. You guys keep talking. I actually pulled up the wrong.
Say something deep.
Excuse me.
Well, I mean, I think this thing of, there's a lot at stake, including what gets imaged, but where it gets shown. I mean, I think I'm glad we finally gotten to the F word. Fascism is, I mean, it's a very serious charge, and I think it's correct to be making it. I think Trump and his administration, I think he personally is a fascist, and they are trying to sort of move America in a significantly fascist direction and have that as a form of rule. Given that, what people do in their lives, in their political action, and including artists in their art, does matter. If we continue to say, well, I'm just going to be doing what I always did, well, that might be a problem depending on what you did. And so, I think there's a real urgency. And it's I mean, there is both a question of truth. I mean, I think there's the battle over whether truth exists or not, and we can talk about whether truth is a question of strong belief or whether there is reality that underlies that. We could go there, but I think the main thing is that argument about whether there is reality and whether it's knowable or whether it's just might makes right and whoever's the strongest, actually that's what's true, that's a big question in society. And so the artists coming in on this terrain, including on fighting over whether fascism is going to get consolidated, right now, I mean, there is, there's a situation where there's a guy that is threatening nuclear war potentially with North Korea. People are being locked out of the border. Families are being destroyed. People are having guns pointed at their head right now based on what this guy is doing, and he's threatening to do a lot more. There are, what does it mean for, say, life on colleges when the commander-in-chief is a avowed sexual predator and talks about that as just like, hey, that's just locker room talk. That's how guys are. Well, what's that going to mean for all the guys who now feel, that's, how we should be. Let's, knock all this 60s and 70s crap out, and we got to get back to the way America should be. It was great when we could rape, And so what artists do in this period, including around truth and contesting around that, matters tremendously. And so I think that this is a time for tremendous urgency in some works that might have seemed important, prior to November, might not seem so important now, and works that we do now might actually not necessarily be great in the long term, but actually might be very important to do in the short term. And, you know, so, I mean, we could talk more about it, but I just think there's tremendous urgency, and it's not just about art. I think fundamentally people need to drive this regime from power, both Trump and Pence and all the people that came with him. And it's not that I was happy under Obama. I think, you know, he was the deporter-in-chief and the droner-in-chief and had a lot of problems. And I said earlier, America was founded on slavery and genocide. It's based on oppression and exploitation down to this day. I'm not a big fan of America, but I think that this particular regime is causing tremendous harm for sort of people right now, and even just deep into the future with what it's planning on doing with shredding environmental norms and ratcheting up the heating of the planet. And so there is a lot at stake, and you know what people do in the coming weeks, months, and years will really matter a lot, including what we do with our art.
And so, based jumping off of that too.
That was really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
Really.
Thank you, Dred. Yeah. Another question that I had is, what capacity does art have to change politics, both personally, locally, and globally?
I think art can be a very strong impetus for fighting back, for resisting. The question, though, is whether or not art will be used in that way, will be seen in that way. We've talked and we've heard about the ways in which this administration is reacting and acting. And also one of the ways in which it's acting is to muzzle and control art through the kind of funding and support that art can get. But I feel that this is a moment for really pulling together and fighting back and changing. For some reason, as Dred was talking, what came to mind, this very strong image that came to mind was, at one point I was in Milan and I was walking toward the train station, and the architecture of the train station is brutish. And it made me feel more than I'd felt through words or understanding the power of fascism, that it's this huge block, and it's frightening. But in order to fight it, it's as though each of us has to pull into the David that's inside us and fight that energy. Because if we don't, we get crushed. It is so big, it is so domineering that it flattens us. But the challenge now, I think, is for us, through art, through coming together, through understanding one another, through figuring out what our truth is and what the collective truth is to fight against the powers that are out there to crush. And not necessarily to crush back, but to stand up in the truth that we have, the energy that we have, the history that we know, what we believe.
I think it's all very numbing. And I think what you say is very important, finding that drive to fight back or stand up. And I mean, that's something that I'm trying to figure out in my own practice. I was thinking about what you said before of talk about truth by telling lies, and how that operates maybe in my practice, thinking of opacity and not trying to tell. But I mean, that goes back to a different conversation. I think it veered maybe in a direction that I wasn't necessarily thinking, but thinking of opacity, being confronted with the situation of someone else trying to define you, and then opacity as a strategy to confuse or to mirror the projections that are thrown onto you. That's what I was thinking about, but that was the previous question.
It's all welcome.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I can't top like anything they said. They said like pretty, you know.
It was pretty great.
Would, yeah, that was pretty great. But if I can add anything, maybe self-care, you know, think about that and how not to be burned out, because I feel that's also something that's going on. And I feel it's very strategic, and it's just something to be aware of.
And so do you think art can be part of that self-care
for sure,
or
yeah.
nourishment?
Well, I think
that, first of all, I want to say that your work was a tremendous balm to me. Seeing the video in the show, it was tremendously affecting to me. And I have had friends and students see the show, and they've all been like deeply, deeply moved by your work. So please don't think that it's not this radical act of presence, because it is. And you're going to have like little girls and young female art students go back to their studios with your work in their head. And that's part of the work that we do. That's part of the work that you do. I also think that there's a weird moment internally and externally, right? Like internally, I really want to make something that's going to make people take to the streets and like stuff like that. But I'm not, you know. And Walter Benjamin talks about this, the way that film is able to mobilize people in a way that, you know, I don't know if the visual arts are the way to mobilize a population. I don't know if they don't have the reach that popular media does anymore. You have more people upset about that ridiculous Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad, you know, like that's what has mobilized people. So, I mean, I think that if artists are going to have that kind of effect, it's going to have to be through popular media. And I also think, like, I think about my parents, who I'm so glad are not alive now to witness what's happening. But I think about what you were saying about self-care. They had none. Like, there was no rest for them. And they fought. Like, my parents fought their entire lives from the time they woke up in the morning. And, you know, my mother used to say, ain't nobody tired. Like, you don't have time for that. Like, there's no time. You have to fight. And that's just what it means to be alive, is that you have to fight. And I get a tremendous amount of care from art. Like, looking at your work was transformative for me. And I'm not just saying that because you're sitting here. It was transformative for me. And, like, there's a Matisse show opening at the MFA. Like, Matisse has nothing to do with my life. Like, nothing to do with my life. But as a 8-year-old boy in Detroit, Michigan, seeing a Matisse painting, it was transformative. I was like, I want to live in a world where I can do that. Like, that's the thing. That's the gift of public art collections and art schools and stuff like that. You give these people this opportunity to see, like, the world, and it's part of their own cultural inheritance. It's not something that belongs to something else. It belongs to them.
I think a couple of, I mean, on this sort of the importance for art for sustaining people is, I think there's a lot to that. I jokingly tell people, Joe Strummer saved my life. Joe Strummer was a musician in the band The Clash, and I never met him. But at a time when there was one asshole on either side of the ocean who was threatening to destroy the world through nuclear war to expand their empire, it seemed like the people who were running the world were crazy, and they were. But as a kid growing up trying to process that, when nobody's saying, no, that's true, and then you discover musicians who are like, no, actually, it is really true. The people that are running the world are crazy. That makes a lot of sense. And when you find other people and other art and ideas that actually reflect what you have sort of an inkling of, it actually matters a lot. When I, see, artists that I like, whose work that I like, even though I know that the world around me is actually in a very dark and getting in a darker place, it actually gives me some strength to say, well, all right, I either learned something new, or I saw something new, or I had a joyous experience, and I can fight harder. And related to that is, like, if the coup said, if people don't pound back, they don't bound back. And I think that's true in art, too. If people don't actually take on the oppression that exists, then they actually are forced to accept it, and they become broken, and that's very important that not happen. And then the final thing on art, I mean, it is true if you have a film that is a Hollywood film and is showing on millions of screens at once, or showing to millions of people at once, then you probably have more reach than most visual art. But that's actually not universal. I mean, we don't know when certain visual art is going to become part of major discussion. When I had what's the proper way to display a U.S. flag, when I was a 24-year-old art student and the President of the United States was denouncing it, the Congress was literally outlawing it, and people were standing in line for an hour to see it, and other people were calling in when I did talk shows from halfway around the country discussing the work. And the people that were standing in line for an hour, sometimes there were people in the housing projects going to see contemporary conceptual artwork, which otherwise wouldn't happen. Or the painting that's on view at the Whitney now that people are talking a lot about. My mom, who's not, I mean, she likes art, but she's not an artist. She lives in Chicago. She was like calling me to say, what do you think about that painting? And so there are, ways in which visual art can sometimes, depending on how it concentrates and typifies certain questions, can become part of what moves people. It's not, if you're saying, well, we only are going to be able to do one sort of art, and we want to reach the most people, yeah, film would probably be the way to do it. But I do really think that all sorts of art could, it's like, this radical stuff in the 50s was beat poetry. Who would have picked that? But that's, where a lot of ideas of counterculture and dissent, including, one of the things, it talks about, gay male love. And that, it's like, well, where was that going to come in film? I mean, it did, but it didn't really. But you could write a poem and have a small obscure press in San Francisco that then everybody's talking about, and it's speaking for a generation. So, I don't think form is determinative. I think there are certain ways mass forms do reach more people spontaneously, but a lot of times it's spontaneously meeting people with a lot of deadening crap. And the real question is, can you, with whatever form, make art that is actually challenging the traditional way people see and think to help them see in new ways and experience new things?
Also, social media, I wanted to bring up, because it's also a new kind of element that is playing into that issue of visibility and reach and access. I'm suspicious of it because it's very fleeting and it's very of the moment, and I'm not sure how impactful it is on the long run, but at least in terms of visibility and one artwork or one artist or one discourse, when it takes off, and it can be, very, I'm not finding the word, but, very, lots of impact.
It can reach so many people all at once. Yeah, kind of the same way like you were talking about popular media really affecting the masses.
Well, Dread really made you rethink what I said about that. That's really important.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I think that the best part of life is like, I learned something today. Like, that's great, But I forgot the impact of, and now I'm thinking back of other artworks that like sort of came to the fore in sort of controversy, like, Andrea Serrano and things like that, yeah.
So Steve, I really loved what you were saying about visiting public collections in Detroit.
I really love you too, Sam.
I love you, Steve. And I was, one thing that Barbara touched upon earlier was about the strategic defunding of the NEA and the NEH. And I was wondering if you would all respond to that a little bit, maybe also harken upon like any other experiences that you all had with institutions and access to art.
Well, I teach at a public institution. Like, this is a public institution, so I believe in public access to the arts. Mm-hmm. I teach at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. It's the only freestanding public art college in the country. And so, I mean, I believe in that. I believe in access, right? Mm-hmm. I grew up in Detroit, a city that where auto workers decided that they were going to fund a public museum, like that, where that was, and when recently there was a bankruptcy in Detroit, and people were deciding that they were going to sell off the collection to pay off not to pay off any of the outstanding debt, but to pay creditors interest. So the debt never would have been erased. It's just that
just to maintain.
Bankers would have gotten money from that almost priceless collection. you know, people in Detroit, where it's a rather depleted tax base, right? People in Detroit agreed to raise their own property taxes in order to fund the museum. So that's why that's the culture I grew up in, that even though people may not have known a lot about art, they understood its importance, they understood the access to it. Every school kid went through that museum. I had a direct relationship with that collection growing up. And that was one of the things that formed me as an artist, was a direct relation. I would go to my museum and walk around and have that relationship. I don't see young people having that kind of access now. I don't see young people having a sense of ownership with cultural institutions. I don't see young people invited to free rehearsals at the symphony. Like, because there's this way in which either the outreach isn't being done or the literacy about the importance of it isn't communicated to people. And I don't think that I think the differences between people, and I'm a little Pollyanna in this regard, I think the differences among people have more to do with access than anything else. You know, if people have the same access to things, then we wouldn't be privileging one group above another. And my whole career as an artist is based on that access. You know, having access to cultural institutions, having access to art. And I don't come from a wealthy family. Like, my mother was a billing clerk, my father was an auto worker. I don't come from a wealthy family. But, you know, I grew up looking at, you know, I would skip school and take the bus to the museum and walk through the museum by myself because I felt like it was my place. I never felt like I wasn't welcome there. And so I say to my students, like, oh, I don't feel welcome at the museum. I'm like, what are we doing where young people don't feel welcome in museums? Like, what is going on? And so that, to me, is the question I have with culture, is like, how come I had a residency at a museum, and the museum director, who was lovely, asked me what we could do to get more people to come to the museum, right? And I said, get in an Uber, go to a public school, and say, hi, I run a museum. I would like you to come visit me. Here's some free tickets. Wellesley College has a bus that will bring students to the museum. All you have to do is call and say, my students want to come to Wellesley and see the show. They send a bus. So, like, if there's that commitment to getting people engaged, there are plenty of people who will do it. It's just that people, like, how do we do it? How do we get people, I just don't know. Like, how do we get people in? Like, go get them, bring them, put them in a car and bring them. You know, maybe give them lunch, like, bring them. That's the thing.
I've also I've experienced a strange phenomena where the gallery is still a brand new program. Not a lot of people know about it, even on campus. But even then, I've seen people come up to the entrance, to the door of the gallery, and, you know, lean in and look in the space, but not actually enter. Right. And I've had to welcome people in. Literally, like, get up and welcome them into the space and tell them that it's here for them. And there's some divide with that they don't feel like it's theirs, or that they don't feel, like you said, like they don't feel welcome. Or
some of it has to do with the the sort of inside the white cube stuff. Sure. That it comes to us through Brian O'Doherty's analysis of gallery spaces. But other parts of it is just like, the framework of the gallery has been appropriated by commerce. So a lot of places where you go do high-end shopping look like art galleries. So when people see the track lighting, they
galleries look like high-end commerce places.
Well, yeah, and it's like that sort of exchange between the two. So when you come, it's like, oh, it's really expensive in there. I don't want to go in there. Right. And then when you go to New York, they have like the girl in the black thing, and then all the binders up there. The binders are empty. Did you know this? I did not know this. All the binders are empty. I had no idea. They're just there to, like, it's like a Belasco or something. It's like they're just there to look like important, but they're all empty. Can I see that binder, please?
You've opened something up for me, and I'm not quite sure how to go about it, but I would love to be involved here in Boston, maybe as a start, but elsewhere, in figuring out how to break down and lower those barriers so that art becomes not something, you know, up on a hill, something for wealthy people, but something that is all of our patrimony, that it belongs to us, that we go see it over and over. I love the idea that you would, you know, leave school and the museum became your school. That was, you know, those were your teachers. Yeah, and I would love for us to have more and more of that.
I want to come back a little bit to the original question of what does it mean for the threats against the NEA, the NEH, and PBS. And I think this is an administration which has targeted very well-respected artists. They've said that Hamilton, the most successful Broadway musical right now, the cast should apologize personally to Donald Trump. Meryl Streep was overrated. So most significant movie actress, most significant Broadway musical. They've gone after Madonna and said that she should be tried for treason for her statements at the Women's March. They've gone after Saturday Night Live, the most popular late night TV comedy show. He's also gone after the press and said that this is an enemy of the people, the most dishonest human beings on earth. They're trying to shut down anything that challenges them. And so cutting out the NEA and the NEH, on the one hand, it will actually have significant effect on communities, including in rural areas that support, the one big museum in Paducah, Kentucky. It's got NEA funding, The Detroit Museum, I'm sure they got NEA funding for some show for something, But it also, but beyond those museums that are going to lose access for kids, it also means that the stuff that is more challenging. I, as an individual artist, don't get NEA funding. They cut that out in the 80s when people like Karen Finley and Robert Mapplethorpe and Andre Serrano were actually sort of making them think, wait a minute, there are all these people who don't think like us about Christian fundamentalist family values, so we actually have to prevent them from getting access to funds. So they said, well, look, we won't fund individual artists. We'll actually just fund museums and galleries. Well, the Museum of Modern Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the ballets, they get a lot of that funding. The majority of the funding goes to places like that, which provides access. But also other small institutions that I and the artists up here rely on. I mean, both funding organizations, but small galleries would not exist at all without some of that funding. It would be that the margins that they work on are fine enough that you cut that out, then you actually cut out anybody who is actually going to say, well, let's make something that really, some of the art that is potentially most destabilizing and threatening will be cut out. It won't be funded. It won't have a venue to show. There's a project right now that I'm working on called Slave Rebellion Reenactment, which is going to reenact the largest rebellion of enslaved people in North American history. It's going to have 500 plus people in period-specific costumes marching for 26 miles, chanting about going to New Orleans to end slavery with guns and cane knives and sickles and muskets and sabers and horses. As an ancillary project to that, we're having a lot of scholarly research and presentations done that will talk about the 1811 revolt that it's based on. We're applying for an NEH grant, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, to just talk about this American history. The most significant slave revolt in U.S. history is not that well known. And so we want that to be more well known. What does it mean if the college, which is a major university, Tulane University, can't actually get funding to do that research? It means that those stories don't get told. And that's, I think, part of what's at stake here. It's actually, the NEA and NEH are minuscule parts of the federal budget, but they actually are about contesting ideas. So going back to what's the proper way to display a U.S. flag, when I was an undergraduate student, the Congress was speaking about my work on the floor of the Congress. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the police, all that powerful arsenal, all that was threatened by an undergraduate art student at a Midwestern school raising a question about what is U.S. patriotism represent. That question was a dangerous question, and the art that talked about it was dangerous art. And so they wanted to try and stop that. These ideas matter tremendously, and particularly when the emperor has no clothes, you want to actually make sure that nobody that sees that they have no clothes can talk to anybody else and communicate about that.
I do think it's important to know that you're going to make that work no matter what happens. Yes. So I think that there's a way in which, like, NEA funding and the humanities funding, the way that it does cutting off that funding wounds people at the margins. I totally agree with that 150%. I do think, though, that the way funding works for institutions that are funded by the NEA, some of them, well, let me put it like this. We have a major museum in Massachusetts that gets NEA funding. I don't understand why they get NEA funding. So, like, how that discussion happens is part of public funding of the arts in this country is a political quagmire, for lack of a better way to put it. And it's always really ripe to put it on the chopping block to get people inside it. Like, not the arts, not Sesame Street, not Big Bird. Like, that's the way people respond to these sort of cuts in funding. People in the arts, however, understand the impact that a small amount of money has. So it may not seem like a lot of money in the federal budget, but it has a tremendous impact. I also think, though, that people need to fund the alternative spaces. Like, the people who use them, the people who go to them, they need to fund them. Like, don't bitch when you have to pay a cover charge to go see a band. Like, like pay to go see, like, a film screening. Like, there's a way in which not-for-profit status doesn't mean that it's free. It means it's not for profit. And so if we don't support our own institutions with whatever money that we have, we kind of don't deserve them. There's like a wonderful relationship between funding a community art center and experiencing the work of that community art center, and then knowing that it's sustained by your donations. So I think that it's two parts of the same thing. I've never been a big fan of public funding of the arts because I always think about what the money's connected to. So I've never been a fan of it, but I do understand the impact of it, and it's important. I prefer to fund the things that I am interested in. I make sure that they hear from me. I write them a check. I don't have a lot of money, but I give it because I want to be implicated in the work that those places do.
The policies that the federal government set influence what happens. Now, again, full disclosure, I think we need revolution. I am not a fan of America. I think America is the problem in the world, or one of the big ones. But what policies federal government set in terms of what they fund, how they fund, determines lots of things. Like right now, if they, say that there's a battle over Planned Parenthood, whether federal money is going to go to one of the largest centers that women get any sort of health care in the country is potentially cut off because, some people's interpretation of the Christian Bible are like, that violates my beliefs and I happen to be in a position of authority, so I will prevent women from having any sort of care because some women get abortions at this particular place. What policies in terms of the art, frankly, there should be a lot more money going to the arts, and it should actually stimulate and spur on lots more, divergent and wacky ideas, including radical political ideas. I don't think that necessarily will happen. I don't have faith in this country, but I do think what I advocate for would be it should have more funding in the arts, and I think that the other side of that is the policies that are getting set specifically for the arts. One thing that's happening is a change in, say, the tax code, where it's going to be, there will not be as many incentives to give to nonprofits. And so I'm on the board of the New York Foundation for the Arts. Some people that are board members are saying, well, I don't know if I want to give as much as I have because I'm not going to get the tax break. What's that going to mean? That more artists don't get services, because the federal government has changed the tax code, which actually further restricts the money that's available for art. And so it says for the rich people, look, you keep your money, don't give it to nonprofits, and make those people fund it themselves, and they have less money because let's say we've said, well, we'll take out any tax subsidies for health care. so that they have even less money, and pharmaceutical companies at the same time have less restriction, and so they can jack up the prices of their medicine. So people are paying more. It's extremely regressive, both tax base, but also tax form, but also other policies that are meaning the people with less are paying more, and the people with more are paying less.
I don't disagree with you at all.
No, I know.
I think that the struggle that I have is like I look at, like I have a friend who's very, very wealthy, who got like that ridiculous tax cut when the second Bush was president, that ridiculous astronomical tax cut. So he filed his taxes under the old thing, right, and figured out how much money he was saving, and he decided that he would donate that money. Now, I'm not saying that everyone is like that. I know that people want to keep their money. I want to keep my money, but I don't have a lot of it. If I had a lot of money, would I be a different person? I don't know. But I do look at this notion that people are donating because they get a benefit. And that is the part that public funding of the arts will take away. Like if the arts are publicly funded, people will fund them because they want to fund them, not because they're getting something in return. So on the one hand, I do support that notion that we do need more public funding for the arts. I look at like government art sometimes, and I think, that was a bad idea. That was just a bad idea. Like, God rest Martin Luther King. He died today, April 4, back in 1968. That memorial to him in D.C., that's public art, right? And I just thought, he white, like super white. Like
You finally made it.
The whitest object that they could actually put on the mall. And I just thought, wow. Like, they could have called a brother before they did that. They could have called John Wilson to make that sculpture. So when we talk about, like, government funding of the arts, we're talking about bureaucracy, we're talking about all these other things. I think that if we go back to the original NEA model where artists were deciding what got funded, that is the goal. But I don't know if that's ever going to happen.
But we're also talking government funding of films by Sergei Eisenstein, of work by Alexander Rodchenko and Stepova.
But, I mean, honestly, though, that's so over. Like, that kind of, like, I don't really see that kind of work getting funded now.
Well, not in this country, no. It's
Right.
not going to. But the point is, I would still advocate for the money and then fight for artists to actually use it to do that, as opposed to saying, well, look, really what you're going to get is more Martin Luther King statues.
Whereas places like Mexico, they're so wealthy with so much fantastic art and public spaces filled with art.
Well, that's why they want to build a wall to keep Americans out, so they don't steal their art.
But also, I mean, I think that, you have a lot of wonderful, like, public art in Chicago, and some of it is, like, challenging, and some of it is really, like, so, like, there's a model where it can work. It could actually work, where you could give individual artist grants. But in Massachusetts, we couldn't even get a 1% for art bill passed with all the new construction that's happening. So don't get me started.
So I hate to wrap things up, but we have, I know, time passed by so quickly, and we have. Yeah, if
We have them ask questions. There's an audience.
I have a question for Sam.
Yeah. Well, I want to leave time for Q&A, and so I guess we'll break here for that, or if any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask as well.
That's my question.
Feel free. Okay, that's good. So if anyone has any questions, let's see. Let's get a mic.
If you guys don't ask us questions, we'll ask you questions.
So I was wondering about what you might think of the Dadaist movement in terms of how they presented their art in response to some of the upheaval that was happening in Europe at the time and in the world, and other maybe movements or models for resistance through art that might come to mind as noteworthy.
Do you have anything, Trevor?
Well, I mean, when I was a young art student, I got into art through photography. I had a father that, before I was born, was a professional photographer, and during my lifetime was a serious amateur photographer. I grew up with cameras all around me, and I got a good camera when I was, 12, and, I mostly used it to take family photos and stuff like that, but I took a lot of pictures. My parents were foolish enough to buy me a camera and put film in it. Yeah, I mean, it's like, when I was like 6 or 7, they bought me film for an Instamatic camera when we were on a family trip, and I took probably 30 pictures of a star-shaped swimming pool. I mean, this was not you would have had to been pretty visionary to realize, yeah, that guy's got some talent. So I knew, but I did learn how to take a good picture, regardless of, what I was thinking about it, but I didn't know anything about art. So I ended up in art school somewhat by accident. I wasn't the kid who liked to draw and paint. And so I'm growing up, in this period that it is Reagan's America, and it's a real nightmare, but I'm trying to figure out, well, how do I make art that talks about this? I know how to make photographs, and my school, they actually forced me to take classes outside of what I would normally take. So I was taking performance art classes and painting classes and stuff, which was good. It was making me think. But the things that were most transformative were the art history classes, and particularly when I discovered the Dadaists. I was like, oh, I get what those guys are trying to do. They lived in a world that was like, coming apart at the seams, and the bourgeoisie was actually plunging the world into chaos and actually planning to destroy their world so they can expand their empires. That's what I'm living in. And so when I saw Kurt Schwitters and Meersbau, that was like, okay, I get that. That actually makes sense to me. That, this and some of the performances that were happening at the time were, basically, they intended to offend the audience, but it was specifically a bourgeois audience, and they were like, fuck you. Why are you? And it's like that. In some cases, that's where they came from, but it was really, and particularly when you got into people that more crossed over, the George Grosses of the world, which wasn't formally a Dadaist, but him and Hannah Hocken, people that were actually responding to the same thing. But the aftermath of World War I and seeing the carnage, that was, just a nightmare for humanity. That was absolutely there was no good side in that war. There was a revolution that happened because of it that was good, but the World War I was just carnage and slaughter for expanding capitalism and imperialism. And so, these artists were in various ways rebelling against that culture, the culture that both against the war, but rebelling against the culture that was upheld by the people who made the war. And so that, I think, is very, it's a very important art movement, even if it's, sort of somewhat facilely deemed anti-art, but it's sort of, if it's anti the art that existed that was part of this culture of, justification for war, then yes, being anti-art is good. And so, like, in this period, it's like, there, a lot of what is the most popular, most popular culture, I think, be it television, be it music, or be it, frankly, popular visual art, is deadening and should be opposed in some way. When I go through Chelsea, which is, the main art district in New York, often I just want to slit my wrists. It's like, why do half these people get up in the morning and make what they make? Why does another section of people get up and say, oh, I'm going to sell that, and another section of people get up and say, I can write about that, and somebody else say, yeah, this is really great, I got to buy this. It's like, it's like you people are part of the problem. And so, I think there's a lot to learn from the Dadaists. I haven't gone back and really studied them as a more mature artist, but I think that to the degree people are studying art and art history, that's a period to look to, because it was really a rejection of a lot of sort of ossified and staid culture. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think subversion is incredibly important in art. From Caravaggio being commissioned pieces from the Catholic Church and him being critical of them through his works. Similar with, like, right outside our front door, there's a gas tank with the Sister Corita Kent on it that she subversively snuck a profile of Ho Chi Minh into it. And it's there right off of 93 with thousands of people driving up and down that highway seeing that every day. And I think that's, right at the heart of like what Dred was talking about with the Dadaists revolting, and is kind of what I was trying to look at with this exhibition as well, different approaches to subversion. And did you have something to add too, Joiri?
I was thinking of, you said other movements that brought up similar ideas. I was thinking of how I learned about the Dadaists in art school. I had to go to art school to learn who those folks were, versus more populist art and thinking of revolution and changing, ideologies en masse. I thought of the Mexican muralists just to bring up like a totally different, radically different example. But in thinking of representation and access, because as you said, they were a part of the bourgeoisie. So, yeah, I was just thinking about that.
I think more. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Can I ask how old you are? Okay, so you remember the AIDS epidemic. You're old enough to remember it, right? So ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, they had a branch called Visual AIDS, which was this sort of agitprop group that made political objects and interventions. There's also Grand Fury, Granfury, and that's Donald Moffat and Marlene McCarty. And the Grand Fury is very interesting because they started out as this incredibly high-powered group that was making all sorts of imagery in public using advertising and marketing strategies. So they were using the same strategies that Benetton was using to make this sort of advertising-based interventions about the AIDS epidemic. And I think they went to Venice. They were in the Biennale, right? With this huge piece about the Pope, right? So like going right, and it's one of those things, just like you invited a bunch of gay men to do an intervention, to make art in the Vatican. What do you think they're going to do? Like, what do you think is going to happen, right? So that moment is a key one, right? Sort of close to the contemporary moment. Grand Fury ends because they realize that they can't do anything. They sort of, their impotence sort of ends them. And I think that their last intervention said, with 40,000 dead, art is not enough, Then you have the Guerrilla Girls, sort of a research-based practice, interventionist, aggressive, non-apologetic, and it really activated something in the art world. It was very specific to the art world, but it really did activate something. Then back in the 70s at Cal Arts, you have the feminist art program. And that is a really incredible model. There's a journal called Heresies. And that's all I can think of right now. But if you go to Mira Shore, do you know her? She's like one of the greatest artists on the planet, right? Miraschor. She wrote this book called Wet on painting, feminism, and art culture. And she has a blog called A Year of Positive Thinking. Is that Nikki? Hey, girl! Oh, my God! Oh, sorry. All right, but that's it.
Yeah. Yes?
I'm probably the oldest person here. Well, I would like to... I am teaching political art at Tufts University, and my comment and question is that I have the feeling that during the last 30 years, artists badly failed. There is something very wrong with the approach towards the art nowadays, because that situation where we are now, when few rich pigs own most of the wealth in the society, and the capitalism is actually much, much more stronger than it used to be. I blame the artists for that. We failed. I am also the artist. And I have the question, what kind of a new revolutionary, really revolutionary approach we should just find out? I was a part myself of a very unique artistic movement which was called second culture in Czechoslovakia under so-called totalitarian system. And we actually succeeded to stir the revolution in Czechoslovakia in 89, which was called Velvet Revolution, and change the complete system in the country. And listen, it had nothing to do with money. You were still talking about some funding, you know, and if there is no funding, there is no art. We didn't have any money. While we were able to sort of create so much of art and so much of influential art and with a big impact on the society. So there is something very fundamentally wrong. I hate galleries, I hate museums. I would prefer to take that art, which is dead for me, and to place it back to the context of the public. Place it on subway, you know, public bathrooms, everything, you know. Let's try to find some new approach, new revolution. That second culture philosophy of our revolutionary movement was based on the fact that we didn't want to do anything with the establishment. We just didn't want any money from them. We didn't want any recognition. We didn't want any rewards, any medallions from them. We just wanted to create a completely separate culture. Therefore, it was called second culture or parallel polis. And we sort of started to use a tactic where we would be like addressing each other on horizontal level, not asking those assholes in the government. All governments are filled with assholes, you know, no matter where, you know. So, and it was very successful, and there was no economy involved. So therefore, I would like to ask you, you know, would you suggest some really new revolutionary approach? Yeah, like Buchanan was suggesting to remove all the painting from Dresden Gallery when there was a revolution in 1848 and put it on the barricades in order to test if the culture would respect all that crap, old crap, you know, which is in those museums.
What do you think, Dred? I feel like...
Well, I mean, we could decide to talk for the next 6 hours about that. There's a lot that's been put on the table, and I will speak to some of it. I mean, I think fundamentally the revolution I'm talking about is not principally trying to create a new culture, but to actually get to a different world. And while what I'm about to say will lead to much bigger questions that I don't know that we have time to get into, I actually think that, you know, the revolution I'm talking about is basically a new type of communism, and as envisioned by Bob Avakian, who's the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party. It's not like let's move back to 1930s Russia or 1970s China, but it is really based in those revolutions and what Marx was talking about. I think it's important to get to a world without classes, and I actually do think that that takes revolution, which art has to be part of, but is not the same as. And so I'm not saying we just need to create a different culture. I think we actually need to create a new society that has a different economy at the foundation of the society. And so the art that's part of, you know, helping people push towards that, I think actually has to be part of that. And in that sense, it's not, I mean, I don't think that, you know, while I don't want to, I don't care about medals from rich people, but I do think that in this country, it's a complex society, and I don't think that all people with some money, or even all people with a lot of money, are the enemy. I think that the question is, are you actually going to prop up and defend and do things that support U.S. imperialism and capitalism, or are you actually going to contribute to getting rid of that in sweeping and broad, complex ways? Some of my art shows on street corners without permission. Some of it shows in major museums, and I value reaching each audience not because I wish all my work could be in museums and I just can't find a way to get the stuff that I want to do on the street corners in the museums because the museums won't let me, but because I actually want to reach people who could give a fuck about museums, who might be walking right next to a museum and they don't want to go in it because they don't feel comfortable. I mean, you say you felt comfortable going into museums as a kid. I hated going to museums. They made me feel so uncomfortable, like I was going to steal something. And so there are people that haven't been brought up in museums, or feel uncomfortable in them, and so I want to reach some of those people. And I think it's important to actually talk about what we're trying to bring into being, and try and bring all sorts of people into that. If you view that most people here don't have a stake in defending a system that's based on exploitation and oppression, then you can bring in all sorts of different kinds of people. And what the art is that's part of that, I don't think there's one formal or prescriptive thing. I think, yes, there should be a lot more art that's in the streets in new and exciting ways, and including on buses, but also, do new performances that maybe you're more inspired by Auguste Boal. And I'm not some big person into Boal, but I do think that, when you intervene in spaces in new ways, that actually has potential. And I don't think it has necessarily more potential than, a particular painting hanging in a gallery, but I do think that it's like, as much as I like, say, a lot of what Grand Fury and ACT UP did, and I think we should also give credit to Avram Finkelstein, who developed The Silence Equals Death, which is iconic and lives probably way beyond anything else that Grand Fury and ACT UP did. And people who might not know about ACT UP know about that. And so but I think that some of these things. But as much as I love some of that work, that just going back to say, well, let's go back to doing, billboards, which I've done billboards. I like them. I don't think that in and of itself is particularly radical, as this new this damn Pepsi commercial is showing. I mean, capital can try and co-opt anything, and so, I think that, if people have access to doing billboards, they should do billboards. But the question is, what's on that billboard? What is the content of it? How does it make people sort of further question and undermine the legitimacy of a system which, frankly, is illegitimate? Mm-hmm. A system which is based on exploitation and is actually, just as, really simple things like Donald Trump has basically told the army they can go bomb wherever they want. Nobody's going to stop them. That's happening. We're sitting in this room having a nice conversation about art. Do people want to live in a world where kids in Pakistan are being blown to bits so that we can have a nice room to talk about art? Most of you don't want to do that, I suspect. I don't know any of you really, but I suspect you're not thinking of that. But then the question is, do you view this government as legitimate? Are you trying to say, well, we need to make this democracy work. We need to have a new election so that we can actually get the will of the people exercised? Well, the whole setup is a framework to get any system that produces a Trump is illegitimate. The fact that, if we say he's a fascist, and nobody on this panel has disagreed that he's a fascist, well, what does it mean for the Democratic candidate to say, oh, I'm going to go shake hands with Hitler and say, hey, I'm glad you're here. Let's have a talk. No, you don't do that. You say, this is unacceptable, it's illegitimate if you think it's illegitimate, but they don't. And so both political parties actually have fundamental unity on keeping this system going, regardless of whether they have to do it with fascism or whether they do it with traditional imperialism and capitalism. And so, and I say traditional because I think fascism is just actually a particular manifestation of the political rule of capitalism, imperialism. And so I think the thing is the art on the billboards in the streets that's activist art more specifically, or if it's a painting in a museum or a song, is it actually moving people to question this system and actually help contribute to a movement for revolution so we can get rid of this system?
So,
I just want to say one thing. I haven't failed at anything. I really haven't. I haven't failed as an artist. There's this way in which it's not my job. I didn't make it this way. Mm-hmm. I did not fuck this up. Mm-hmm. I did not fuck this up. All right. Mm-hmm. So like I get really, really tired of this. Black people have been in this country for over 300 years. We didn't come up with chattel slavery. We didn't come up with industrial slavery. We didn't come up with Jim Crow. We didn't come up with sundown towns. We didn't come up with leash laws for human beings. We didn't come up with lynching. We didn't come up with the Three-Fifths Compromise. We didn't come up with the Missouri Compromise. We didn't start the Civil War. We didn't end the Civil War. We didn't come up with redlining. We didn't come up with any of that shit, right? We were never meant to survive here. So it's sort of incredible that the notion that I have, or any artist of my generation, or